Thanks everyone on this panel, everyone who's come. I don't think I've ever been on a panel with speakers who are this knowledgeable on these issues, and I've been learning a lot, and it's been very interesting, and has helped solve a number of questions, so thanks guys. Sorry, I'm just going to help time myself here. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is, because these folks have covered a lot of the basic chemical, biological, more local political issues, I'm going to talk about what is actually going to be necessary in terms of a real political movement to stop or steer away from climate change, because obviously we're already experiencing a lot of it, and actually halt fracking and a lot of the other dangerous extraction measures that we're facing. And I'm going to talk, there's a few broad strokes of some technical things, but mainly what I want to talk about are the social conditions that we're under and the class dynamics of this struggle. So let's begin by imagining what actually is necessary to steer away from climate change. Number one, the most basic thing, and this is nothing complicated, that we all know, is that if we're going to steer away from climate change, it means that an enormous amount of these fossil fuel reserves need to stay underground. Any solution that you offer, whether it's cap and trade, carbon tax, mass demonstrations, nationalization, creating all kinds of new renewables, if it does not keep this stuff underground, then it's not going to work. And so what does it mean? What is like one of the first things that it means to keep this stuff underground? Well, Bill McKibben has pointed out that there's 5 times, of the known reserves, are 5 times as much as would be necessary to create enormous catastrophe beyond anything which international agreement thinks is tenable. At the same time, these known fossil fuel reserves, according to at least one estimate that McKibben cites, are equal to about $27 trillion in value in corporate assets of some of the largest corporations and economic powers on planet Earth. In addition to this $27 trillion, 4/5 of which we really should keep underground, there's about $10 trillion in fossil fuel infrastructure. So to keep this in context, because we're talking about numbers that none of us really have any kind of sense of what they mean, is global GDP per year is about $70 trillion, and the US GDP is about $16 trillion. And we're talking about the need to keep $30 trillion, get $30 trillion off the ledger books. So what I'm trying to say is that if we were tomorrow to institute some kind of policy that actually was going to keep this stuff underground, immediately everyone would realize that this $30 trillion in value is worthless. Now, we know what it's like when that kind of value disappears. It's kind of hard to imagine because it's kind of abstract, but imagine, for instance, at Facebook, you know, if everyone realized all of a sudden Facebook isn't going to turn any profit at all tomorrow, you know, about $100 billion in value would disappear, right? We saw the same thing happen with the housing crisis. And we know that these companies don't exist on their own. If you wipe out $20 or $30 trillion, it's tied to other companies that have given or taken out loans, other companies have insurance policies or agreements. We're talking about an economic crisis on a scale of which, you know, you can't even imagine. But this has got nothing to do with the physical world. This is entirely social relations. And it's interesting because at the same time, we also know that taking all that stuff out of the ground would not hurt the economy in the slightest, necessarily. Actually, the economy might grow because as water supplies are being destroyed by fracking, and we can't get public water in Philadelphia for the life. I mean, everywhere we go, the water fountains are broken. I don't know if that's part of this or not, but when, you know, so we have to buy the bottled water, right? That actually grows the economy because, you know, that's actually water that somebody is buying for a profit, and what is the economy? It's exchange value. It's not useful things like oxygen or clean water, unless it's being sold on the market. So that right there is just key. I know I just wrote about an article, but that has to be our starting point. But then secondly, if you keep this stuff underground, we also know that if you just do that, you're going to plunge billions of people into darkness and starvation and isolation. So at the same time that you do that, you've got to create a whole new way of living. So now we have to imagine, if we're talking about doing this within the marketplace and within capitalism, and if we're expecting these corporations to do it, we have to imagine these companies losing $30 trillion in value and at the same time investing in a whole kind of infrastructure that doesn't require things, I would actually argue, like for the most part, automobiles at all. It doesn't require industrialized agriculture. And none of this stuff, there's no technical difficulty that anyone has pointed out that is all that big. Solar power has been around since 1839. Wind power is as old, I mean, windmills go back before any of this stuff. All you need to do is take a windmill and you add on a generator and you've got wind power, right? Like this stuff could have been done literally 140, 150, 200 years ago. A lot of it. We know how to create cities where people can get around without automobiles. We know that public transit actually can get people places faster if you use the right technology and you have the right setup of the town. But when you do all of that, what is one of the first things you do? You destroy markets for selling goods that make enormous amount of profits. One other aspect of this, so take agriculture. Industrialized agriculture requires relatively low-skilled labor, and that's by design. Capitalists in general, we're going to have to take an empathy exercise here. We're going to have to think like a capitalist for a moment. If you are trying to control your workplace, it's much harder if you have workers who have really expensive degrees. Because if they leave, it's very hard to replace them. If you have workers who have very minimal training, well, if they go on strike or they quit, you can replace them the next day. So an enormous amount of innovation within the society has been organized around not increasing productivity by reducing the amount of work needed, but by increasing productivity by lowering the position of workers in the workplace. Another way they do that is by simply taking control over the labor process. So what's one of the most famous innovations in 20th century industry is the assembly line. Well, does the assembly line actually does it actually like reduce labor? Do workers, does moving the product over to the next worker, does that take an enormous amount of effort? No. What the assembly line does is it allows the boss to control the speed of production. And that's just one of many examples of ways in which modern industry is centered not around reducing labor time or making work easier or nicer, but around controlling workers and getting them to work harder and faster than they would if they were simply working according to what is comfortable and natural to their bodies. So to put it simply, if you are getting a profit, would you rather invest that in training your workers in a skill that they could then take to another employer, or they could even maybe start their own business? Or would you rather invest that in machinery that raises the barrier to entry for your field and increases the dependence of the workers on you for a livelihood? Generally, it's the latter. This is not to say that all machinery is evil and the devil, but it's to show that the technology that we have is not necessarily the best thing. So what Richard Levins has argued is that when we're talking about creating a new society, we're not necessarily we're not anti-technology, but instead of going for high capital-intensive, dead labor-intensive machinery, we will probably move more and more towards knowledge-intensive labor, and agroecology is probably a very good example of that. Secondly, I think we often see this stuff with fracking and petroleum in reverse. We often look at it like, okay, they ran out of all the easy stuff to get, now they're going for the hard stuff, like the stuff you need to frack to get. And so for us, it's like, okay, they're really desperate, so they need to do these really extreme things. But I tend to think of it more along the lines that you guys were talking about it, as like, what they're thinking is, okay, there's far less of this stuff around, which means that it's much easier to monopolize the market for production of these fossil fuels, which means it's easier to control the prices. Now, it seems like the natural gas industry has not done that right. It seems like they got too excited about those prospects and they overproduced. But the petroleum industry has been very good and disciplined at keeping production down so they get these really high monopoly prices. One number that Daniel Tamuro cites is that the petroleum industry makes 1.2 billion euros in profit above the average rate of profit. So investment flows towards this particular type of energy production because it is concentrated and rare. If it were plentiful like sunlight and the wind, well, you run into these problems like you can set up a nice little solar farm, but it's easy enough for someone else to do the same thing that it's much easier for what's happening with the natural gas industry to happen to you all the time. You know, it's not just like there's other people drilling for natural gas in one of a very few select places for natural gas. There's people simply setting up solar panels wherever there's sunlight or wind turbines wherever there's wind. I'm not saying that if we go to wind and solar, workers will all of a sudden be liberated because we'll be freed from the energy companies. I'm saying that if you're an investor and you have a choice between investing in wind and solar or petroleum, petroleum is a much better investment to make. And so thus that increases the resources of the petroleum industry and the natural gas industry to shape our society so that we are more and more dependent upon them. Secondly, and this is a new thought, so just throwing it out there, again, it goes back to this question of controlling supply and demand. With natural gas and petroleum, it's much easier to do that. You can hold on to that stuff. You can decide to drill it or not. But once you set up a wind turbine or a solar panel, it's like you're just dependent on nature to decide whether or not you're going to produce energy or not. You might be able to convert it into something like hydrogen and hold on to that. But while you're doing that and trying to hold on to that hydrogen, someone else might be selling their solar power to people or wind power to people. They might have more wind than you or sun than you. And this is not a unique thing. The reason why I think this is probably the case, and this is why investors are kind of not excited about wind and solar, is because if you look at any other place that capitalism interacts with nature, it is dead set on getting control over natural processes and adapting them to the market in every way. So if you look at food production, they do everything they can to make food uniform. So like every apple looks the same, every tomato looks the same, every carrot looks the same, because they are terrified of losing a market. They're terrified of one day having some ugly looking carrots and then somebody else getting their carrot market, right? I was just told by a friend, I don't know if it's true, but it sounds like it's true. You know, Subway, for instance, uses cow manure instead of yeast because yeast cannot create uniform bread leavening, so cow manure can. So, you know, but that's definitely, I mean, if you look at the chicken production industry, if you look at anything, and that's not the worst of it, right?
That's not the worst.
It's because they have all these points of uncertainty. They have uncertainty in the marketplace. They don't know if people are going to buy their goods, and they have uncertainty in the labor process. They are not sure if they can get awesome things. They don't have absolute certainty that the workers are going to work as hard as they can. So they do everything they can to gain control over that process and reduce uncertainty. So that right there is a whole bunch of reasons why our social struggles are very important, but these solutions, the very obvious solutions that are before us, cannot be realized in the context of the market. And I also do not think that, and I think we can see a pretty good case, that governments running a capitalist society will also not implement these measures. Even nationalizing these industries with the public, with a government that is organizing a capitalist society, those governments, because they are subordinate to this drive for profit, are not going to make these changes either. So, well, I guess just a couple more things. One is, so finally, I guess, yeah, one of the things I think is really interesting that Richard Levins points out is that if workers take control of this process, and then we have all kinds of new opportunities available. One of the first ones is that there are hundreds, according to the UN, 206 million unemployed people throughout the world who are not going to be used under capitalism to do anything at all, let alone prevent climate change. When workers take control of the means of production in the society and so on, not only can we produce for use instead of profit, but we can employ an amount of human potential that has just so far been squandered. But secondly, we no longer have to treat the world as a collection of things that are being exchanged. We can actually start to treat the world as a bunch of processes that we have rights to and engage in and interact in. So food it's an object, but it can only exist because of a set of processes. And capitalism is not based on supporting and developing and making those processes more healthy. It's based on producing more and more of the thing of food. And in the process, it destroys the cycle and the process that, that makes food possible. So if you look at food production, again, you see all these nutrients leaving the actual cycle of food consumption. So when you eat food, the nutrient, instead of your nutrients going out in your human waste into the soil, it goes into a sewer. When you have a hog farm, the hog's waste doesn't go into the soil, it goes into the ocean, it goes into these massive vats of pig waste. Not only could we reorganize that so that the nutrients go back into food once again, into the soil and thus food, we could also organize non-organic parts of production. Parts of production that are totally human-created, so that they form renewable cycles, similar to the food cycle or the water cycle. We have this conception, I think, that any kind of human-created technology is inherently unsustainable and wasteful because we are only familiar with that kind of technology and the use of it that you experience under capitalism. So I think I'm a little over time. And I'll just say two more things there. Sorry.
You have a couple minutes to finish.
Oh, really? Okay. One of the other issues within the climate movement is that there is this orientation towards localization of everything. And there are certain things that, yes, it is good to localize to some degree or another. In agriculture, there's a lot of evidence that certain kinds of agriculture, if you have local control of a particular plot of land, you're able to take advantage of all kinds of things that you're not if you have one big farm. But again, this is citing Richard Levins, the unit of production is not the same, does not necessarily have to be the same thing as the unit of planning. You can have people organizing their one local plot of land to raise cows, grow a whole variety of crops, but they can also be in coordination with other workers around the region and the world to figure out what general effect they are having on the atmosphere, on the water, on the soil. As it is now, we tend to compete around these things. So Egypt will, in fact, support upsurges in other countries that share the Nile River because they don't want those countries to develop the Nile River because then they lose the nutrients that go up the Nile towards Egypt. And I think it's more obvious than ever that the world is not a collection of local ecological systems. It is a global ecological system. And if it's going to be run sustainably, it's going to have to be done on a world sphere. So that is in a very brief case for planning and global organization. And thanks a lot, folks.